On Monday morning, Donald Trump posted a fresh threat on Truth Social, declaring that starting January 1st, 2027, tariffs on all Canadian cars, trucks, automotive parts, and steel would double to 50%, adding that Canada has been ripping off the United States of America for years and calling it, along with other nations, among the worst in the world to deal with. It was an escalation delivered with the kind of urgency usually reserved for a genuine crisis, arriving less than 72 hours after trade talks between the two countries had already collapsed entirely. Within hours, Mark Carney stood in front of reporters in Montreal and did something almost nobody in Washington seemed to expect. He did not soften. He did not offer a conciliatory gesture to bring Trump back to the table. He said Canada would not accept an attitude at the negotiating table that treats Canada as a subsidiary of the United States, that treats Canadian industry as something meant to be permanently disadvantaged relative to American industry. And in Ontario, Premier Doug Ford went considerably further, telling Trump publicly he could, in Ford's exact words, kiss my ass, and reminding the president that Ontario powers 1.5 million American homes and businesses and is fully prepared to cut that power off if Washington keeps pushing. To understand how quickly this specific standoff escalated from a failed negotiation into open, personal defiance from two of Canada's most senior political figures, you need to walk through exactly what happened in the 72 hours before Trump's latest threat landed, because the sequence explains precisely why Carney and Ford responded the way they did, rather than trying to smooth things over. On July 20th, 2026, Trump signed 3 presidential proclamations invoking Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930, an obscure statute that had not been used to impose tariffs by any American president since 1949, placing a 50% duty on roughly $20 billion of Canadian dairy, alcohol, auto, and other goods. The tariffs were paused for 3 days, just hours before their original August 19th deadline, with Trump publicly declaring the two countries had reached a very fair deal. By the following Wednesday, he was telling reporters at an unrelated White House event that his administration probably had a deal with Canada, calling it good for everyone. Then, late Friday night, it all came apart. Carney pulled Canadian negotiators out of the talks entirely, and the 50% tariffs took effect at 12:01 a.m. Eastern Time on Saturday, exactly as originally scheduled, just 3 days later than planned. Carney did not mince words about why. In recent days, he told reporters, the United States proposed new terms that were uneconomic and unfair, adding a line that has since become the defining quote of this entire collapse. They asked too much, and they offered too little. He went further still, accusing the Trump administration of using economic integration as a weapon, and saying plainly that Canada was not prepared to compromise its sovereignty or undermine its key industries to get a deal signed. Greer, the U.S. Trade Representative, offered a sharply different account, insisting Washington had offered Canada the best treatment of any major exporter to the American market, and framing the collapse as the result of new demands and walkbacks introduced by Canada itself in the closing days. That is the backdrop against which Trump's Monday ultimatum landed, an already collapsed negotiation, competing public accounts of who was actually responsible, and an American president choosing, rather than seeking a path back to the table, to escalate immediately with a fresh threat aimed squarely at Canada's auto sector, one of the most economically significant and politically sensitive industries in the entire country. If you've been following every twist of this standoff and are wondering how Canada's response could have shifted this dramatically, from careful diplomatic language just a few weeks ago to a premier telling the American president to kiss his ass, this is exactly the moment worth understanding in detail, because what happened over these 72 hours reveals a great deal about where this relationship actually stands right now. Carney's specific language in response to Trump's auto threat deserves close attention because it marks a genuine escalation in how directly Canada's own government is now willing to characterize what Washington is actually asking for. He said Washington's auto sector proposals during the collapsed negotiation would have gradually dismantled Canadian production entirely, describing the integrated Canada-US auto relationship as the most successful automotive partnership in history, one Washington's own demands were putting directly at risk. He said Canada had entered the final days of talks willing to drop its own remaining retaliatory tariffs on American steel, aluminum, and autos, and willing to encourage provinces to restore American alcohol sales to store shelves, real substantial concessions offered in good faith. What Canada would not accept, he said, was an attitude at the negotiating table, treating the country as though it existed to be structurally disadvantaged relative to American industry, a demand he characterized as fundamentally incompatible with any deal Canada could actually sign. Greer's own response to that characterization adds an important and somewhat revealing detail to this dispute. He argued that the only reason Canada has auto production in the first place traces back to the Auto Pact of the 1960s, an agreement under which Canada traded market access for American manufacturers in exchange for encouraging vehicle production to locate north of the border. That argument is worth sitting with because it suggests Washington's underlying position in this negotiation is not simply about adjusting tariff percentages on the margins. It is a challenge to the basic historical premise of Canada's entire auto industry, treating decades of integrated North American vehicle production as a kind of conditional privilege rather than a genuine, mutually built partnership. That framing helps explain why Carney reached for language as direct as accusing Washington of wanting to treat Canada as a subsidiary. Because if Greer's own comments accurately reflect the administration's underlying view, that is close to exactly what is being proposed. A restructured relationship where Canadian industrial capacity exists at Washington's discretion rather than as an equal, negotiated partnership. Doug Ford's response deserves its own careful examination, both because of how sharply it broke from typical diplomatic language between two allied governments, and because of what it reveals about the broader Canadian political consensus that has formed since Friday's collapse. Ford, speaking to reporters at a construction site in Hamilton, told Trump directly that he could kiss my ass, a level of bluntness essentially unprecedented from a sitting Canadian premier toward a sitting American president. He went further, warning that if Trump continues targeting Canadian industries, including oil and potash, Ontario is prepared to escalate its own response, potentially including further increases to electricity prices charged to American customers, or cutting off that power entirely. That threat is not empty rhetorical posturing. Ontario supplies electricity to roughly 1.5 million homes and businesses across Michigan, Minnesota, and New York, and Ford has already used this exact leverage once before in this dispute, imposing a 25% surcharge on electricity exports to those same three states during an earlier phase of the standoff, a move that itself prompted Trump to threaten doubling tariffs in response at the time. Trump's own reaction to Ford's comments arrived almost immediately, and it was notably personal rather than focused on policy substance. He described Ford's remarks as lots of bluster and added a pointed, dismissive comparison, calling Ford the less charismatic, intelligent, and overall unimpressive brother of the late Rob Ford, Doug Ford's brother, and the former mayor of Toronto who died in 2016. That kind of personal insult, directed at a sitting provincial premier by a sitting American president in the middle of an active trade dispute, is itself a significant departure from how these two governments have historically managed even their sharpest disagreements, and it suggests the current standoff has moved well past the realm of technical trade negotiation into something considerably more personally charged on both sides. There's another detail from Ford that adds real texture to understanding exactly why the original negotiation collapsed the way it did. Ford disclosed publicly that he had actually opposed the preliminary agreement Carney's government had been considering in the days before talks fell apart, specifically because it would have required Ontario to restore American liquor to store shelves. I wasn't going to put the booze back on the shelves, Ford said bluntly. That admission matters enormously because it reveals that the internal Canadian debate over how far to compromise was genuinely contested, even before Washington's own last-minute demands became the public justification for walking away entirely. Carney was managing pressure from at least two directions simultaneously in these final days, Washington pushing for more concessions on one side, and at least one of his own country's most powerful provincial premiers pushing back against the concessions already on the table on the other. Carney's answer to when Canada might actually return to the negotiating table is worth quoting directly because it sets a genuinely high bar for any resumption of talks, rather than leaving the door vaguely open. Before talks could resume, he said, Monday, the United States would need to adopt the right attitude towards Canadian industries. He was specific about what that meant. In practice, rejecting explicitly any negotiating posture built around the idea that Canada is a subsidiary of the United States, or that Canadian industry should be permanently disadvantaged relative to its American counterpart. That is not a soft, face-saving formula designed to make a quick return to talks easy. It is a direct challenge to the underlying premise Greer's own comments about the Auto Pact appeared to reflect, meaning any renewed negotiation would require Washington to essentially abandon the framing its own trade representative had just publicly defended, a genuinely difficult needle for either side to thread quickly. The dollar-for-dollar retaliation Carney announced over the weekend remains on track, regardless of how this latest round of threats and counter-threats plays out. Canada's own tariffs, concentrated in steel, dairy, appliances, agricultural equipment, pulp and paper, and electronics, are still scheduled to take effect on September 8th, matching Washington's 50% duties precisely. Provincial support for that response has been notably unified. Manitoba Premier Wab Kinew said his province stood 100% behind Carney's direction to retaliate. Finance Minister François-Philippe Champagne confirmed Ottawa is assembling a targeted support package for small and medium-sized businesses focused specifically on British Columbia, Ontario, and Quebec, the three provinces expected to be hit hardest by the tariffs already in effect. It's worth understanding exactly how large the numbers involved in this specific escalation actually are, because Trump's new auto threat is not a minor addendum to the existing dispute. Current American tariffs on non-U.S. automotive content sit at 25%. Doubling that rate to 50% starting January 1st, 2027 would apply not just to finished vehicles, but to automotive parts and steel as well, striking directly at an industry built around components crossing the Canada-U.S. border multiple times during a single vehicle's production process. Canada ranks as the third largest source of American imports overall, with more than $380 billion in goods crossing the border in 2025 alone, according to Census Bureau figures, and the auto sector sits at the very center of that integrated relationship. A tariff increase this significant, announced with a full 16 months of advance notice rather than the abrupt, immediate deadlines that characterized earlier rounds of this dispute, gives both governments considerably more runway to either negotiate a resolution or, alternatively, to let both economies begin genuinely restructuring their auto supply chains around the assumption that this higher rate is now the permanent baseline. There's also a dairy dimension to this standoff that deserves attention, because it illustrates just how many separate irritants remain genuinely unresolved, even as the headline auto threat dominates coverage. A wide array of Canadian dairy products, milk, cheeses, butter, and whey among them, remain caught directly in the tariff crossfire, representing roughly $780 million in American purchases from Canada last year. Alcohol remains just as contested. Canadian provinces pulled American liquor from government store shelves early in this dispute, and those bans largely remain in place today, with Ford's own public refusal to reverse that policy in Ontario, specifically underscoring just how far from resolved this particular irritant remains, even as other sectors edge towards some form of eventual settlement. Underneath all of this sits the broader question of what happens to the USMCA framework itself, the trade agreement all three countries technically remain bound by even as Section 338 tariffs, and now these fresh auto threats bypass its core protections entirely. On July 1st, Washington already declined to renew the agreement in its current form, plunging it into a period of rolling annual reviews and ongoing renegotiation that stretches out toward 2036, rather than the clean 16-year extension both Canada and Mexico had originally sought. Trump's latest escalation, arriving less than 2 months after that review concluded, and delivered with a 16-month runway attached rather than an immediate deadline, suggests Washington may be settling in for a considerably longer and more structural confrontation over the terms of this relationship, rather than treating the current standoff as a temporary dispute to be resolved quickly through renewed talks. There is a legal dimension worth remembering here, too, because it shapes how durable any of these threats actually are, regardless of the political rhetoric surrounding them. Section 338, the statute underlying the original 50% tariffs now in effect, had sat unused for 96 years before this administration revived it. Only after the Supreme Court struck down Trump's broader emergency powers tariff authority back in February 2026. Trade lawyers flagged the statute's fragility almost immediately, arguing it had likely been superseded decades ago by the Trade Expansion Act of 1962 and the Trade Act of 1974. That legal uncertainty was never resolved through the negotiation that just collapsed, and it remains an open question hanging over every subsequent escalation, including Monday's new auto tariff threat, which would presumably need its own separate legal justification given its extended multi-year timeline rather than the emergency-style proclamation structure Section 338 originally relied on. What actually happens between now and January 1st, 2027, when the doubled auto tariffs are set to take effect, and more immediately, between now and September 8th, when Canada's own retaliation is scheduled to begin, remains genuinely uncertain. Carney has left the door open to a renewed deal, but only on terms that would require Washington to abandon the exact framing Greer's own recent comments defended publicly. Ford has signaled Ontario is prepared to escalate further still if Washington keeps targeting Canadian industries, specifically naming electricity, oil, and potash as tools still available if this standoff continues deepening. And Trump, for his part, has shown no indication over the past 72 hours that his administration is inclined toward de-escalation, choosing instead to layer a new, longer horizon threat on top of an already collapsed negotiation within days of that collapse becoming public. There's also a currency and markets dimension worth understanding here, because professional traders reacted to Monday's fresh escalation with genuine, measurable urgency, layering new uncertainty on top of what was already a volatile week. The Canadian dollar, which had already absorbed a sharp move once Friday's collapse became public, faced renewed pressure once Trump's auto tariff threat landed, with currency desks scrambling to reprice Canadian assets against the prospect of a doubled tariff rate arriving in just over a year. That kind of compounding uncertainty, one shock following another within days rather than weeks, is precisely the environment economists warn creates the most damage, because it makes it nearly impossible for businesses to plan investment or hiring decisions around any single stable assumption about where this relationship is actually headed. Steel and aluminum markets, already adjusting to the 50% duties that took effect Saturday, now face an additional question of whether those same sectors get swept into whatever final shape the doubled auto tariffs eventually take when they arrive in 2027, given that Trump's Monday Post explicitly named steel alongside cars, trucks, and automotive parts as targets of the new escalation. It is also worth understanding just how directly this new threat lands on specific Canadian communities and specific companies making real decisions right now, rather than treating it as an abstract policy announcement with effects confined to some distant future date. Auto assembly plants and parts suppliers across Ontario, the province most deeply integrated into cross-border vehicle production, are now facing a genuinely unusual planning problem. A known future tariff increase arriving on a specific date more than a year away, layered on top of already active 50% tariffs hitting a different set of goods today. That combination forces companies to make investment decisions, now based on a tariff schedule that itself remains subject to further negotiation, further escalation, or potentially a negotiated reversal, none of which can be confidently predicted, given how quickly this dispute has already moved from confident claims of an imminent deal to open, personal hostility between senior officials on both sides. Executives in the auto sector have historically valued predictability above almost any other factor when making multi-year capital investment decisions, and the current environment offers essentially none of that, regardless of which specific tariff rate eventually proves to be the lasting one. The domestic political reaction across Canada to this latest escalation has been notably swift and notably unified, building directly on the consolidation of opinion that had already begun forming in the immediate aftermath of Friday's collapse. Beyond Kinu's declaration of full support for Manitoba, other provincial leaders have echoed similar sentiments in the hours since Trump's Monday Post, framing the new auto threat not as a negotiating tactic to be carefully managed, but as confirmation that the earlier collapse reflected a genuine structural disagreement rather than a temporary miscommunication that quieter diplomacy might quickly resolve. That kind of rapid cross-provincial alignment matters because it gives Carney's government considerably more room to hold a firm line without facing the kind of internal political fragmentation that characterized earlier, more divided stages of this year-long dispute, when premiers disagreed openly about how aggressively Ottawa should respond to Washington's pressure. There's a broader lesson sitting inside how quickly this specific relationship has deteriorated over just the past several days, one that extends well beyond the particular tariff percentages now being threatened. For months, Washington's public messaging around this negotiation consistently implied that sustained pressure would eventually force Canadian capitulation, that a country sending roughly 70% of its exports south had no real alternative but to accept whatever terms Washington ultimately offered. The events of the past 72 hours suggest that calculation may have badly misjudged how Canada's political leadership across multiple levels of government and multiple political parties would actually respond once pushed this far. Carney's explicit refusal to accept subsidiary status, delivered in careful, deliberate language befitting a former central banker, and Ford's blunt, personal defiance, delivered in language that could not be further from typical diplomatic register, represent two very different rhetorical styles converging on the same underlying message: that further escalation from Washington is being met with equal or greater resolve from Ottawa and the provinces, not the quiet accommodation the administration's earlier public statements seem to assume would eventually materialize. Let's talk about what these accumulating threats actually mean in dollar terms, because the scale involved across all these overlapping disputes is now large enough that the effects will not stay confined to trade ministries and press conferences for very long. The 50% tariffs already in effect since Saturday cover roughly $20 billion in Canadian exports annually. Canada's own retaliatory measures, still on track for September 8th, are designed to match that figure dollar for dollar across steel, dairy, appliances, agricultural equipment, pulp and paper, and electronics. Layer on top of that a doubled auto tariff arriving in 2027, applying to an industry responsible for a substantial share of the more than $380 billion in total goods that crossed the border from Canada into the United States last year, and the cumulative scale of economic disruption being discussed across these various fronts starts to look considerably larger than the headline $20 billion figure that dominated coverage of the original Section 338 proclamations back in July. Economists tracking this dispute have been consistent in pointing out where the actual cost of all this escalation ultimately lands, and it is worth restating clearly, given how much the political rhetoric on both sides tends to obscure this basic mechanical reality. Tariffs are collected from importers, not exporters, meaning American companies bringing Canadian goods across the border are the ones directly paying every one of these duties. current and threatened alike, not Canadian producers shipping them south. That structural reality means every escalation Trump announces, however politically satisfying it may be framed as punishing Canada, functions simultaneously as a tax increase on American businesses and, ultimately, American consumers purchasing everything from vehicles to dairy products to steel-dependent construction materials. Analysts have warned that a sustained multi-front tariff regime like the one now taking shape across autos, steel, dairy, and the broader Section 338 categories will likely push consumer prices higher on both sides of the border simultaneously, at a moment when inflation concerns remain a genuine political pressure point in both countries. Ford's electricity threat deserves particular attention as a case study in exactly how this kind of escalation can move beyond conventional tariff disputes into territory with genuinely immediate physical consequences. Ontario's earlier 25% surcharge on electricity exports to Michigan, Minnesota, and New York during a previous phase of this standoff was not a symbolic gesture. It represented real measurable costs passed directly to American utility customers and businesses in those three states, a form of leverage considerably more difficult for Washington to simply tariff its way around, since electricity cannot be easily rerouted through alternative suppliers, the way many goods can over time. Ford's renewed threat to potentially cut that power off entirely, rather than merely surcharge it, represents a meaningful escalation from that earlier episode, and one that Trump's own history of responding to Ontario's electricity leverage with further tariff threats suggests he takes considerably more seriously than some of the more conventional trade rhetoric flying in both directions this week. There's also a historical echo worth sitting with here because the broader legal foundation underlying Washington's approach throughout this entire episode carries a legacy that makes the current escalation feel like familiar territory rather than something genuinely new. Section 338, the statute behind the original 50% tariffs, lives inside the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930, a law so widely blamed for deepening the Great Depression that economics students still study it as the textbook case of retaliatory trade policy backfiring on the very economy it claimed to protect. More than 1,000 economists warned President Hoover against signing it at the time. He signed it anyway, and global trade collapsed by roughly 65% in the years that followed. Watching a dispute rooted in that same Depression-era statute escalate into personal insults between a sitting president and a provincial premier, followed within days by a threat to double tariffs on an entire industry more than a year in advance, suggests this standoff has moved well past the kind of technical trade friction that earlier, more conventional negotiating tools were originally designed to manage. So where does this actually leave both countries as this specific dispute continues unfolding day by day? Carney's own conditions for returning to the table, an explicit rejection of any negotiating posture, treating Canada as subordinate to American industry, set a genuinely high bar that Washington's own recent public comments have shown little appetite to meet. Ford's willingness to escalate further, specifically naming electricity, oil, and potash as tools still in reserve, suggests Ontario at least is prepared to keep raising the stakes rather than seeking a quiet off-ramp. And Trump's own pattern throughout this entire year-long dispute, confident claims of progress followed by abrupt, often personally charged escalation, once talks fail to produce the outcome he anticipated, gives little indication that the administration's own approach is likely to shift toward a more conciliatory posture in the immediate term, particularly given how recently and how publicly this latest threat was delivered. What is unmistakable, regardless of how the coming weeks and months unfold, is that this entire standoff has now moved decisively beyond the realm of careful, technical trade negotiation and into something considerably more personal, more public, and more difficult for either government to walk back without appearing to have lost the confrontation entirely. A dispute that began in July with a nearly forgotten Depression-era statute has, within the space of about 5 weeks, escalated through a collapsed deal, a wave of dollar-for-dollar retaliation, a doubled tariff threat extending into 2027, and now open personal hostility between a sitting American president and a Canadian provincial premier. Each of those escalations has made the next one somewhat easier to imagine and somewhat harder to walk back from, a dynamic that, historically, in disputes of this scale between economically interdependent countries, tends to persist considerably longer than either side initially expects, once the political cost of visibly backing down starts to outweigh the economic cost of continuing to escalate. An administration that spent months insisting Canada had no real leverage and no genuine alternative to eventual capitulation is now facing a Canadian Prime Minister publicly refusing to accept subsidiary status and a provincial premier publicly threatening to cut electricity to American homes while telling the president, in almost exactly these words, to kiss his ass. Whether that posture holds firm as the economic pressure from these tariffs continues accumulating on both sides of the border, or whether it eventually gives way to a renewed round of quieter, more conventional diplomacy, is the question that will define this relationship for the remainder of 2026 and likely well beyond it. If this breakdown helped you understand exactly what happened in these last critical 72 hours and why Canada's response has been this forceful, consider subscribing so you catch how this develops as September 8th and the broader standoff continue unfolding, and share this with anyone who missed just how personal and how pointed this fight has actually become. Drop a comment below with your own read on this. Does Canada's blunt, defiant response mark a genuine turning point in how this country deals with Washington going forward? Or is this the kind of tough talk that quietly softens once the economic pressure on both sides becomes too costly to sustain?